Welcome to our Ed Talk, where we will be talking about the importance of education and economic development. Why do we care about education? Human capital is the total amount of human capacities that can increase production. This includes things like health and education. In development, health and education are important objectives, which is why they are also tenets in Amartya Sen's capabilities approach and core values of economic development. As inputs in the aggregate production function, they are also important to growth and development. Healthier children are able to attend more school, learn more effectively, and have a lower depreciation of education capital. Better educated people are able to use public health programs more effectively, learn hygiene and sanitation, and become health professionals. Better health systems improve educational outcomes, which in turn improve people's health, creating a virtuous cycle. Clearly, both health and education are factors that can contribute to development. Let's focus on education.
We'll start by looking at whether or not pooling economic resources into education has meaningful results. The article, Helping Children Catch Up, Early Life Shocks in the Progressa Experiment, attempts to answer whether or not it is possible to mitigate the impact of early life shocks on educational attainment and employment outcomes. The study uses data from local weather stations and the Progressa Experiment in order to determine the effects of an early life endowment shock or investment shock. Adverse rainfall is considered a negative endowment shock because of the impact rainfall has on agricultural output. The study shows that in years where annual rainfall is more than one standard deviation from the locality-specific mean, agricultural wages drop. The investment shock is based on the Progressa Experiment. This is a cash transfer program in low-income rural regions of Mexico, which seeks to incentivize education by providing payment to mothers whose children attend school 80% of the time. The study produced positive results. For individuals who were born in a year of adverse rainfall, an additional year of exposure to the Progressive program increased years of schooling by 0.19 years. For those born in a year of normal rainfall, an additional year of exposure to the Progressive program still increased years of schooling by 0.1 years. In addition, the Progressive program had positive effects on grade progression and employment outcomes. This graph summarizes these results. You can see that the treatment group, who took part in the Progressive program for 1.5 years longer than the control group, scores far above the pooled and control groups in educational outcomes. The key findings of this study suggest that yes, early life shocks can be remediated through investments, and that these investments are more impactful for those who have a lower endowment due to adverse early life circumstances. It is also important to note that another study, which looked at the longer run effects of the Progressive experiment, found the positive effects on educational attainment to be robust with the passage of time. This provides support for potential policy interventions aiming to offset the inequality generated by early life circumstances. In fact, conditional cash transfer programs like Progressa have been adopted in more than 30 countries. Despite their gain in popularity, many families are still not sending their children to school.
We can't fully consider the topic of education without discussing the long-term value of schooling and the opportunity costs associated with it. Should families commit their own resources to pursuing education? Many poorer families would love to send their children to school, but find the returns to not be worth what they miss out on: child labor. Perhaps they are well-founded in their decisions, given the difficulties in turning education into true growth. However, sometimes the earning potential of more educated children is undervalued. So, how accurately are returns to schooling being projected, and what are the reasons that parents are pulling their children out of school? First, we can look at Diana Kruger's 2007 article titled Coffee Production Effects on Child Labor and Schooling in Rural Brazil. Kruger utilizes data from 7-round surveys and revolves the results around the effect of coffee production, allowing in economic conditions to proxy for the value of children's time. With this approach, we can see both the choices made regarding education and the interplay between those choices and traditional models of child labor. Kruger begins by discussing Basu's model for child labor with a good and bad equilibrium. This forms a basis for understanding child labor and allows the paper to dive into the effects of changes in short-term conditions that may only be temporary. In this case, that was the strong economic climates for coffee production. Coffee has historically been significant in the Brazilian economy, and coffee GDP can interact with the child wage and preferences to lead to different incentives for households, considered here to be maximizing the utility of one adult and one child. In general, the results extrapolated from econometric regression signify an important impact of economic conditions on educational attainment. Consistent with findings in prior research, child labor increased and school enrollment for the same group dropped during times of strong local economic activity. This is especially true for middle-income children, as a 10% increase in coffee production corresponds to a 4% increase in probability of employment. The middle and lower-income children face adverse effects from these temporary shocks much more frequently than higher-income children. So, We can clearly see here that income-constrained households sometimes choose to sacrifice children's education given the ability to increase income through child labor. While certain policies may be targeted at eliminating child labor to remedy this issue, others hypothesize a correction of asymmetric information that could be even more valuable. Do the parents and children in these situations understand the long-term impact of education and make choices only due to constraints, or are perceptions on returns to education misguided? We can explore this through another paper, Robert Jensen's 2010 discussion titled The Perceived Returns to Education and the Demand for Schooling. Here, Jensen examines the value of education from a different angle. Educational attainment is lagging in a number of developing countries. This particular study focuses on the Dominican Republic, where just 25 to 30% of children complete secondary school. Potential explanations include high discount rates and credit constraints, but Jensen explores further as an issue of misinformation. The data is based on surveys of 8th graders in different school clusters. These surveys asked about perceived returns to education and found that students often had little idea of the benefits. While overestimating returns to education is a real risk, particularly in developing countries, Jensen was able to follow survey respondents over a 4-year period to get an understanding of their actions based on changing perceptions. All individuals calculate internally their net present value of education based on future income, a discount rate, and the opportunity cost of giving up income in the present. Information given to children in the treatment group regarding future incomes would theoretically increase the value they'd hold for future income in this calculation. Could this be a key factor in improving enrollment rates and educational attainment in developing countries? The results found are encouraging in this regard. Of the treatment group, which received the additional information, 54% of respondents had increased their income expectations in future survey rounds. Instrumental variable estimates are significant for returning to school in years of schooling based on perceived returns. Long-term, results find that those in the treatment group had achieved 0.18 more years of schooling over the 4 years post-survey, and they were 7% more likely to have returned to school following the completion of mandatory primary school. These effects were particularly striking for the less poor students, signifying the importance of perceived returns in encouraging educational attainment. Overall, in both studies, we see that the poorest families are constrained in the short term and unable to focus on returns in the future whether they have accurate representations of that value or not. So what steps can policymakers take to improve the quality of education across the developing world to make the investment worth it?
Now that we have discussed how perceptions and resource allocation can affect education, let's talk about what can be done to increase the returns from investments in education. Duflo et al. Published a paper in 2015. In 2015, Duflo et al. Published a paper titled School Governance, Teacher Incentives, and Pupil-Teacher Ratios, Experimental Evidence from Kenyan Primary Schools. This paper demonstrated how teacher incentives rather than teacher-to-student ratio improves educational outcomes in Kenyan schools. In Kenya, government leaders pool resources to encourage more individuals to enter the teaching profession. The central government's Ministry of Education trains and assigns many teachers to teach in communities across Kenya. In addition to centrally provided teachers, community locals can serve as contracted teachers, often being hired through the Parent-Teacher Association. As a part of Kenya's extra teacher program, randomly selected Kenyan classrooms added a second teacher per classroom, improving teacher-to-student ratio. Interestingly enough, Duflo et al.'s data showed that test scores did not increase significantly for students in smaller class sizes. The study also looked at the impact of school-based management, a way for community officials to interact with teachers and have a better understanding of teacher effectiveness. The goal of parent involvement is to counter the common practice of teacher absenteeism, which compromises student education. Centrally hired teachers did not have the oversight characteristic of locally hired teachers, and therefore centrally hired teachers were held less accountable. As such, during random attendance checks, centrally hired teachers were absent 16 percentage points more than locally hired teachers. Locally hired contract teachers not only had lower rates of absenteeism, their students also exhibited higher test scores, which could be a result from a more present and less absent teacher. The study also gave randomly selected parents a 90-minute school-based management training. The training informed parents on how to interview and select job applicants, how to assess teachers' effort and performance, how to monitor schools' management of the program, and how to perform a formal review of a contracted teacher to see if the community wants to renew this contract. Additionally, adding an element of school-based management reduced teacher absenteeism by additional 12 percentage points. In addition, school-based management led to an even greater increase in test scores than locally hired teachers alone. On average, centrally hired teachers get paid over 4 times more than locally hired teachers. Another trend is that locally hired teachers tend to use their current positions as a stepping stone to eventually get hired by the Teacher Service Commission. Clearly, Kenya's current system of education is ineffective. Poorly monitored and therefore ineffective teachers are paid greatly more. Taking a step back, one can see that this study indicates that education effectiveness relies heavily on teacher incentives and accountability. Kenya's system is broken because teachers are incentivized for not being held accountable. However, increasing accountability of teachers is a relatively inexpensive procedure. School-based management, which increased teacher accountability as well as educational outcomes of students, was also a low commitment cost-wise and time-wise for communities and parents. This study shows that education is not necessarily improved by hiring teachers. A stronger approach would be to incentivize current teachers to do a better job. Aside from focusing on improving teachers, schools can use a different...
Even though most children were enrolled in school, in 2005, a survey found that 44% of children aged 7 to 12 in India could not read a basic paragraph, and 50% could not do subtraction. This trend persisted even in urban areas where student and teacher absenteeism is generally not an issue. Under these conditions, efforts to increase school enrollment do not appear to improve test scores. Therefore, Banerjee, Cole, Duflo, and Linden looked for a way to increase the quality of the schools in addition to what was being done to improve enrollment. Several studies have shown that spending more on resources like textbooks, flip charts, or additional teachers do not have an impact on test scores, which has led to a general skepticism towards spending money on inputs to improve education. However, there is not enough evidence to argue against funding all inputs, especially if there are still specific unmet needs. Education systems often cater to the elite, which means that not everyone's needs may be met. This provided an opportunity to evaluate the effects of a program that targeted children from poor families. The first intervention targeted the weakest children, where a Balsaki, or trained young female teacher, worked on basic skills with 3rd and 4th grade children who had not yet mastered them, for 2 hours a day. The second intervention was a computer-assisted learning program for all children in grade 4. This program took advantage of the government's provision of 4 computers in 80% of the primary schools in Vadodara. Teachers provided students with 2 hours of shared computer time per week. During this time, students played games that tested their skills and were adapted to each child's math level. Contrary to previous literature, the study found that both programs had a substantial positive effect on children's academic achievement, at least in the short run. The remedial education program increased average test scores in the treatment schools by 0.14 standard deviations in the first year and 0.28 in the second year. Students in the Balsaki program gained 0.6 standard deviations in the second year. The computer-assisted learning program increased math scores by 0.35 standard deviations the first year and 0.47 the next year, and was equally effective for all children. While these large gains were short-lived, some effects persisted over time, with students in the Balsaki schools scoring 0.1 standard deviations above their control group peers 1 year after leaving the program. The low cost and sustainability of the Balsaki program are a result of training local women to instruct the classes, which distinguishes it from standard remedial programs that usually use highly qualified individuals for small group or individual instruction. The computer-assisted learning program also ensured that computers provided by the government were actually being used in the classroom, since in many schools they weren't. In terms of the cost of improving test scores, scaling up the Balsaki program was much more cost-effective than hiring new teachers, and 5 to 7 times more cost-effective than expanding computer-assisted learning programs, at least in the short term. Therefore, it appears that focusing on weaker students through remedial programs is beneficial in improving educational outcomes.
There are some differing views on the extent of education's impact on economic growth. While the book The Elusive Quest for Growth by Easterly says that education has not done much for growth, many of the studies we have discussed today argue that investing in economic resources is in fact worth it. In either case, it is certain that investment in education must be accompanied with strong infrastructure, social support, and quality teachers in order to maximize the effectiveness.